Is that good now? Lovely. So today's lecture, once again, is on the French Revolution. This is France in 1789, the beginning of 1789, and it's as you can see, there's places called like Brittany and Poitou and Normandy and so on. It's a place that really isn't France as we know it. It's not going to be France as we know it until after the Revolution. And what I mean by that is it's just kind of a whole bunch of territories that have been cobbled together from the medieval period under a French monarchy going forward. And so they don't have the same, you and I think they speak French, but really the dialects that they're speaking are oftentimes so different that they don't understand each other from north to south or east to west. Different systems of weights and measures, different laws, different traditions, different privileges in various places. And so it's kind of like, or if you want to think of it, it's kind of if you looked at it in a map in a different way, it might kind of look like the Holy Roman Empire back when it used to look like, vomited Skittles. What the heck? Oh, here. I'm having troubles today. Here we go. I hope. So the French Revolution is really kind of a mixture, or has a mixture of causes. I think one of the major intellectual causes, of course, is the Enlightenment. And you just got done dealing with the Glorious Revolution as a part of the Enlightenment. You know that the Enlightenment has connections to trying to question tradition and trying to come up with rational reforms of government or of education or of religious policy, of criminal justice. And so you're going to see all of that stuff being attempted with this French Revolution. Another really big part of the French Revolution is simply that there was debt. And this debt is the king's debt because the king says, that the king is the state. Sovereignty belongs only to the king. If the king fights a war, it's the king's war, and therefore all the debt racked up for that war is the king's debt. It's not national debt, not the public's debt yet. So the problem with this debt is that the French had been fighting wars since, gosh, Louis XIV's four wars that he fought. The really big one was the War of Spanish Succession. Beyond Louis XIV, we had a war of Austrian succession. We had a 7 Years' War, and then there's a war that happens between France and Britain right before 1789. And I'd love for somebody to tell me what that war was. It started perfect. Yeah, I think I don't know if you think about this, but the French are really key to helping us break away from Britain. I think they don't get a lot of credit for that sometimes, but they spend crazy amounts of money on all of those wars and just racking up debt, and they don't really have the wherewithal to pay off that debt because the richest people, the nobles, don't have to pay taxes, basically. Added to that, and this just happens from time to time, is poor harvests. Every time there's a French Revolution, you can go back to 2, 3 years beforehand and see that there are poor harvests. Poor harvests mean that the price of food goes up. People who are buying food, like the city poor and maybe the lower middle class in the cities, they have to pay for their food, and they get really upset about that. They riot about that. And so the poor economy leads to kind of the spark that leads to really the death of the old regime, the absolutist monarchy, the attempt at having one state church in France, and it's really, like I say, the start of modern Europe. This is Louis XIV. I like these two images of Louis XIV. Um, which one do you think is actually probably more accurate of the two? Yes, I think so too. Did I say the 14th? Perfect. I meant the 16th. Yes, exactly. Well, Louis the 16th, who reigns from 1774 to 1793, well, he reigns from 1774 to Well, I guess he does reign until 93. We'll talk about that. You've got this sort of nice image of him on the left, but a more true image of him on the right. He is not the person to be in charge of France during a revolution. Louis XIV would have been the person to have in charge because I think he would have snuffed it out really quickly. But Louis XVI has a whole bunch of problems. He's shy, he's nearsighted, he's supposed to wear glasses, he doesn't want to because it doesn't make him look majestic, and so he's kind of always squinting at people. Um, he's not very bright. His hobbies are locksmithing and clocks. He would have been a wonderful locksmith or clock repairer, but he's just not the person to be king of France. In fact, really, his most basic thing is he wants to be loved. And so he's very indecisive and just a terrible leader for this period of time of of decision making when he doesn't make the right decisions. The financial problems, like I said, go back to the king being poor in the sense that he has this debt that is completely out of line or out of whack with the amount of revenues that they have coming in. They do have revenue that comes in, but it is spoken for. It has to be used. 50% of it has to be used to pay for debts that had already been incurred in wartime previous to any given year. And once again, the problem is that it's the king's debt, it's his debt. Nobody feels like it's their responsibility because there's some sort of, you might have heard of this, taxation related to representation, and he's not allowing representation to happen, and so people don't feel the people who would be represented don't feel like they need to pay taxes or anything like that. So in addition to that, not having a national bank, you might remember that the Dutch had a national bank that allowed them to borrow money on the cheap and fight their wars against France. England, as of the Glorious Revolution, also gets that Dutch institution of a national bank, which makes it easier for the English to pay for wars. All these tax exemptions that happen, all of these nobles not paying taxes, churchmen not paying taxes, it ties up a lot of wealth that could be tapped into to pay for all the king's debt. There are a whole bunch of finance ministers, about four finance ministers that get called, they suggest something, and they get fired right away in the late 1780s. And what they're trying to do is number two, without doing number one at first, and then trying number two with number one. And these numbers that I'm giving you are these things that have to do with new monarchy or the royal state. So hopefully you know this, what is number two in new monarchy or the royal state? What are kings trying to do? Yes, precisely. So they're trying to gain revenue first without doing number one, and then finally with doing number one. And what is number one? Or actually, it is. They're trying to do it with number one. I'm confused today. Number one is, yeah, controlling nobles in parliament. So they're trying to do this without the parliament, essentially, and they're very sketchy about this. And in the end, they the people who are loaning Louis XVI money say you have to call the parliament. You have to do number one or the opposite of number one. You have to call the parliament. It's called the Estates General, or else they won't loan any more money to the king. Well, this forces, Louis XVI to finally call the Estates General. The guy who suggests him calling the Estates General is the guy on the right, a Swiss financier by the name of Jacques Necker. The guy on the left is just one of the other finance ministers, a guy by the name of Turgot, who was one of the physiocrats. So they decided that they're going to call the parliament together or the estates general together. And this is the first time that it's been called since 1614, if I'm not mistaken. And this is now 1789. So it's been more than 100 years since the Estates General was called by a French king. And they want to kind of figure out what the Estates General, what this parliament should be doing in order to fix the problems of France. And so they ask the French people to come up with these lists of grievances, these cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances that the people who get appointed or elected to the Estates General should deal with. They're asking the public opinion. Now, this is really a pretty amazing thing because there isn't really public opinion until around this period of time and going forward. There's what, the common people think, but nobody really particularly cares about this. They're asking French people, what do you think the problems are? And people are writing them down and sending them to Versailles, where this meeting is going to take place. Historians have these lists of grievances. They're a gold mine for historians because you can then see what people at that period of time thought were the problems of France. And you've got to figure that there's lots of enlightened talk in these lists of grievances, about checks and balances and about certain people getting to vote and, that the parliament should be called and so on and so forth. So truly the Enlightenment is present even before the Estates General actually meets in May of 1789. Here's what you have to know, though. They hadn't met in such a long period of time. There was no, clear tradition of what should constitute this parliament, how it should be done. They do know that the Estates General is made up of the three estates, and those three estates are really related a lot to feudalism. And so the first estate, the estate that's closest to or the highest in France, is the clergy. And the clergy are sort of elected, appointed in some sort of way, and about 285 clergymen end up going to the Estates General and representing that first estate or representing the church. What's weird about this, I think, for you and me is, this isn't based on kind of like proportional representation or provinces or anything like that. It's just a hodgepodge of churchmen, mostly high-ranking churchmen, bishops, and so on, and they represent probably around, I don't know, 100,000 total French people out of a population of 20 plus million. So anyway, a third of the delegates are Frenchmen. What they would like to see coming into the Estates General is an end to religious toleration. They want just for the Catholic Church to be supreme again. You might remember that Louis XIV had taken away the Edict of Nantes, and that should be the rule, but quite frankly, it's not. There are Protestants and there are non-believers and so on who are in France at this point in time. And the First Estate would also like to have all education controlled by the church. They don't want to have, non-church schools in existence. If you can get kids when they're young and teach them how to be good Catholics, you can keep them good Catholics for a long period of time. The second estate is the noble estate, and about 308 nobles end up showing up to Versailles. I might have told you that in France there are about 400,000 different kinds of nobles, and so there are 308 people representing 400,000 people as well. They're really, I think, looking for the creation of a constitutional monarchy with civil rights for people. And of course, with this constitutional monarchy, the nobility really want to be a kind of advisory estate or advisory group for whoever is king. In a sense, they're looking for a kind of British government, a parliament that actually helps the king rule. Now, they wanted to, or they were okay with, for the first time ever, really starting to pay their fair share of taxes, but they don't want to end all of these wonderful privileges that they have. People socially defer to them all the time, and the way that they are addressed, the way that they're greeted, the way that they do dress, there's this whole system of hierarchy that is just ever present in France at this period of time, and they don't want to give that up. They recognize themselves as the best people, and they want to continue that. So, like I say, they're looking for the Estates General to become a kind of House of Lords or a House of Commons. Doesn't really make very much sense because those people are common in Britain, and these French nobles are much better than that. So we have about 500,000 people represented by 2/3 of the delegates of uh, of the Estates General. Once again, you don't have to write this because you took this down yesterday, but remember that from the time of Louis XIV all the way up to 1789, you had these nobles who were looking to expand their influence. And so it's going to be, if they get their way and if they have a kind of House of Lords in helping out with the king ruling, then we're going to have really a sort of feudal system and maybe not a very enlightened system. There are 621 people who show up for the third estate, and the third estate is everybody else. Clergy, about 100,000 people, the nobles, about 400,000 people, and 20 million people plus being represented by the 621 guys. Really, the people who show up to represent the everybody else in France besides the clergy and the nobles are bourgeois people. They are educated middle class people. And initially, they thought that there was going to be about 300 or so delegates from the third estate as well. They asked the king, because they're representing 20 million people, the vast majority of Frenchmen. They asked the king to double their number. And that was done. They got to have 621 people representing them. What they were interested in was also a constitutional monarchy, kind of like what the nobles wanted, but they wanted to make sure that the nobles weren't going to have this oligarchy, that the nobles didn't have all the power to advise the king, to make law and that sort of stuff. And truly, that was going to be the problem, or that was going to be the way it was going to work out had things not taken a turn. So my explanation for that is the third estate is made up only of 3 votes when they're deciding something. The first estate gets a vote, the second estate gets a vote, and the third estate gets a vote. And if you vote in that way, then any question that comes up, the first 2 estates are gonna get their way, and quite frankly, the first 2 estates are filled with nobles. The churchmen are nobles, and the nobles are nobles. And so this is the great worry of the third estate, that they're going to have a French Revolution. There's going to be a con but the nobles are going to help the king rule, and they'll be locked out of power. There is a guy by the name of Sieyès, who is Abbé Sieyès. He writes a pamphlet called "What is the Third Estate?" in which he argues that the nobility is kind of a useless social class, and that nobility needs to be abolished, and that the third estate, the everybody else, is the important part of France that should be helping the king rule. And so these folks all really wanted to kind of end feudalism, start a meritocracy, get rid of all the privileges that the nobles had, make sure that the nobles get taxed, and really move France towards a France that isn't just dominated by a single king or dominated by a king with nobles. Like I said, what we have here is a kind of conflict between the nobility and this bourgeoisie, which is rising in terms of wealth based on the agricultural revolution, or based on the beginnings of the industrial revolution. And so there's this conflict going on in the Estates General, a rising bourgeoisie versus an aristocratic resurgence. Both of them want to have a conman, but then the conman is going to look very different. And as I said, how the Estates General meets, how it votes, is controversial. Is it going to be 3 votes, or is it going to be 1,200 votes with all of the clergy and all of the nobles and all of the representatives of the third estate meeting together and voting in that way? Yeah, it's a good question. I think all 3 estates are looking out for themselves. They're looking out for what's going to serve them best, or what their interests are. This is kind of like POV in our hip. And so, what is a clergyman gonna want? Is a clergyman going to be enlightened in any way, shape, or form? I don't think so. I think they're going to want an end to religious toleration. Clergy oftentimes clash with the Enlightenment, or people of faith clash with people who are interested in changing everything based on reason. Now, the next two um, estates are, looking out for themselves, but they, in terms of wanting a stake in power, but I think they tend to be more enlightened because they had been, reading in the Enlightenment and discussing the Enlightenment, and they probably don't want that same thing about religious toleration or the lack of religious toleration that the clergy do, if that makes sense. Here is an image of the Estates General. You probably can't see it, but the king is under that gigantic crown at the very end of things or bottom of things. And you can kind of see everyone sitting around in the center part. Those are going to be the first two estates sitting there in the center. And the third estate is going to get the nosebleed seats beyond the pillars. There was a really kind of a um, a moment at the very beginning of the Estates General when the third estate, came in first, and then the second estate comes in, and the first estate comes in, and the third estate folks were not going to take their caps off. They weren't going to doff their hats to the first two estates. And it's at this point in time with the rules or the social rules that they have about that. It was kind of a moment. But the third estate wanted to establish very early that they weren't going to take the bull of the first two estates. They wanted to make sure that they got more power than the first two estates did. And so, at first the king says, no, you all need to meet separately. That's how it was done traditionally. Yes, we can double the number of delegates to the third estate, but then exactly how the voting was going to go down was sort of left. And so what happens is this: the third estate decides to change its own name. They decide to call itself not the third estate of the Estates General. They decided to call themselves the National Assembly, and they invited the first two estates to come and meet with them together. This is kind of a power play on their part. They want everyone to meet together. They know that if everyone meets together and they vote together, that the third estate is going to win any kind of questions or debates or rules that are going to go down. Well, this is kind of crazy. You don't just get to, change your name. It's not like the United States Senate can say that they represent all Americans and they want the House of Representatives to come meet with them or whatever. What happened was that the pretty much the next day after they had decided to change their name and invite everyone to come meet with them, they got locked out of their meeting room. They show up to this giant meeting room in Versailles where they're supposed to be meeting together, and literally the door is locked. They try to get the custodian to open the door for them. He says he can't find the can't find the keys to the room, and so they think that this is the king sort of putting them down, or the king's locking them out of where they're supposed to meet in punishment for calling themselves the National Assembly. So they just walk down the road a ways and they meet together on a tennis court. And yes, they did have tennis back then. It's a kind of indoor tennis court. And they swear this thing called the tennis court oath, in which they promise to keep meeting, regardless of whether the king is providing them with a meeting chamber or not. They're going to keep meeting together as the quote unquote National Assembly until they had a piece of paper that spelled out all of the rights and responsibilities of French, I'm going to use the word, citizens. And they swear this. They swear to keep meeting together. Well, Louis the 16th hears about this, and now he has to choose a side. He has to say, he either has to go along with this seizure of power by the third estate of the National Assembly, or of the Estates General calling itself the National Assembly, or whether he should side with the first two estates, side with the nobles, and just send everybody home. Say, this has been a disaster. I'm going to send everybody home. That's what he does. Louis XVI decides to call in troops and send everybody from the Estates General home. Any questions about anything that I said up to this point in time? He is, I think, humiliated that he's the first king to call the Estates General in 160 years or whatever it is. I think he doesn't want to lose any of his powers. I don't think he wants a constitution. I don't think he wants a constitutional monarchy, but he is over a barrel because he's not going to be able to pay for his government anymore unless he does this thing. Now that this is turning out to be a mess and he's calling in the troops, he's acting like a despot. He's acting like a an absolutist ruler. It's obviously not going to solve his debt problem, right? But he doesn't know what else to do, and so this is his move in this chess game, so to speak. This is what the tennis court oath looks like according to the painter of the French Revolution, a guy by the name of Jacques Louis David. We'll talk about this kind of painting style. It's called neoclassicism or neoclassical art. And there they are. I think the important part of this particular painting, or this particular, is it a painting? I don't know. Is the figures in the middle. Do you see the three figures in the middle? And do you know what the three figures in the middle represent? Yeah. Exactly. It's the three estates. And so, it's a nobleman on the right, it's a clergyman on the left, and then a guy from the third estate in the middle. And that's exactly what the National Assembly, so-called National Assembly wanted. They wanted all the two other estates to come and join them, not being the Estates General anymore, but the National Assembly. And so that's what Jacques Louis David is representing there. Oh, by the way, do you see the one guy to the far right? He's very funny. See what he's doing? No, no, the guy on the far right. He's the farthest right and to the center. E- Exactly. He's the one guy who's not into this, who refuses to swear the tennis court oath. I don't know who he is. I'm sure the people of the time could tell you. Nobody liked him, obviously. Thomas Jefferson is probably excited when he hears the news that the French are copying the Americans. But soon enough, he won't be very excited because things go pretty far awry. I've got a couple more images for you. This is Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was very unpopular. It's the king's wife. She's Austrian. She's known as Madame Deficit because most French people think that the king's debt is not caused by wars; it's caused by her spending. It's complete bull. It's complete nonsense. But everybody really hates her. Louis the Sixteenth's brother is that guy right there, the Count d'Artois. Both of these two people are the ones who have Louis the Sixteenth's ear and telling him that he needs to side with the nobles against the Third Estate and not become a constitutional monarch and so on and so forth. They view people who aren't noble as the rabble, and they just really are anti-French revolutionaries or counter-revolutionaries. And the Count d'Artois, the king's brother, is going to be fleeing France really before all of the bloodshed starts and things like that. So super conservatives, super traditional, and hated by the people of France. Well, in Paris, this is about 10 miles away from Versailles. Already, people in Paris were all upset about the bad economy that had been going on. Bread riots had been happening. That's when you raid a bakery, as a mob and steal the bread from the bakery. Now they hear that this experiment towards enlightened government is being snuffed out by their king. They hear that troops are on the move. They think that these troops are going to come to Paris and kind of put them down. And so they organize themselves into a militia, into a kind of citizen army in a way. And they go to collect arms. Remember, they're going to be trying to defend Paris against these royal troops that are on the march. And they go to a fortress or a castle called the Bastille, and they're doing that in order to get gunpowder and shot and muskets and things like that. And they also want to rescue the huge numbers of political prisoners that they believe are, suffering in cruel and unusual circumstances inside of this fortress. On July 14, 1789, then this Parisian crowd marches on the Bastille and storms the Bastille. It's truly for them a symbol of royal oppression. It um, it sort of um, reigns over this Parisian neighborhood, and people who are inside the Bastille could shoot down into the neighborhood with cannon or muskets and so on. It really, though, is at this point in time just a symbol of royal oppression, maybe from the past. The prison, quote unquote prison part, it has maybe like 6 people in it. Some of them are insane, and some of them are like um, the sons of noblemen who were imprisoned by their dads for spending too much money. And so there's no political prisoners there. But by storming the king's property, by arming themselves, they are supporting this claim by the Third Estate in Versailles to be the National Assembly. And they seize power in Paris. They chase away the royal officials in Paris, and a new citizen government takes over in Paris. And they're not taking orders from the king; they're taking orders from quote unquote the people. There's some bloodshed that happens at this point in time. The governor of the Bastille defended the Bastille and shot into the crowd and killed a number of people. And by the time they stormed the Bastille and get their hands on him, they kind of beat him to death, and they cut his head off and put it on a pike and march it around. So really, the bloodshed has started on the 14th of July, 1789. Well, now what's Louis going to do? Louis is faced with a revolt of the people, and what he does is he gives in. He's a very indecisive leader. He orders his troops to go back to their barracks. They're not going to, rescue him at Versailles, or they're not going to put down the National Assembly at Versailles. And in fact, he accepts that these citizen militias are a legitimate source of power. He accepts a national guard. He accepts the new Parisian government. He's really recognizing the power of the citizenry. Like I say, a Louis XIV would have just probably, rallied his troops, caused a bloodbath, and everything would have been fine. But Louis XVI is a weak character, and he's giving in to the people. Or maybe the Enlightenment has happened, and you can't be a Louis XIV anymore unless you're willing to just slaughter everybody. So he's recognizing the power of the citizenry. Well, the next thing that happens is a kind of movement of the French Revolution out to the countryside. There's this thing called the Great Fear that happens. And this is really the peasants in the countryside who are having a little storming of the Bastille themselves. What happens is this. For a number of months, with the bad economy, people have been streaming out of cities, coming to the countryside, and extorting food from farmers. And that led to rumors that there were bandits or mercenaries that were being hired by the nobility to, kind of wander through the countryside and keep peasants under control. So a rumor of bandits, paid by the nobles to keep peasants under control is what sparks this thing. Peasants decide to rise up against their local noble and break into their manor houses, break into their little chateaus, and burn feudal records, things that said what their ancestors had owed to the ancestors of the nobles who currently reside in those mansions or in those little chateaus. So they're burning feudal dues, feudal records, and sometimes they're burning the mansions down. They really don't want the nobility to try to continue to impose or reimpose feudal dues on them in an era when feudal dues and taxes don't make any sense. Like we talked about before, it's the state that protects them. It's the state that gives them justice. There's no reason for them to pay feudal dues to the local landlords. And so you can see the local lords fleeing the countryside and the peasants probably happy. And there seems to be something burning there. It might be a church, but there might be also a little tiny chateau that's burning as well. So that's the Great Fear. Well, this National Assembly had claimed that it had powers, and the king had kind of given in to them. And now all 3 estates are meeting together in a National Assembly. And now the National Assembly is faced with this crisis. a crisis in the countryside, the Great Fear, and they have to decide what they're going to do about it. Are they going to order troops to put the peasants down and stop burning, feudal dues or what have you? They're starting to call themselves the National Constituent Assembly. Maybe that has to do with them intending to create a constitution. But what they decided to do was to go with the flow and give in to the peasants. So instead of, telling the peasants that they had to continue to pay feudal dues or, sending out troops to put them down, a number of liberal nobles and liberal clergymen got up on the night of August 4th, 1789, in a meeting of this National Constituent Assembly and said, you know, the time for feudal anything is over. So they renounce their own feudal dues and their feudal rights and their feudal privileges. These guys doing this is kind of like a symbol to all of France that feudalism is no more. They're moving beyond feudalism, and it's the National Constituent Assembly, this body representing France, that's saying that this is okay. So the death of feudalism, more or less, is happening on that August 4th, 1789. You don't have to write all of this stuff down. You could take a picture of it if you wanted to. But it's just interesting, I think, that they come up with a declaration. In the Americas, we had the Declaration of Independence. We were declaring ourselves independent from Britain. The National Constituent Assembly creates a declaration of the rights of man and citizen, and they do this in August of 1789. There's no one to declare to declare themselves independent of, if you think about it that way. And look at how these things you've seen before from different enlightened thinkers. Look at how this just is dripping of the Enlightenment. I think one of the parts is all men are born free and equal, and that all citizens have the right to liberty and property and security and resistance to oppression. Oh, what changed there? What's new? That seems like John Locke, but like John Locke with a French flair. What's the French flair in that? Yeah, and I think you can get that, right? If you think about Louis XIV in particular being the greatest of the absolutist monarchs and oppressing the people. Britain or the United States, we don't really have a lot of oppression in the Louis XIV sense, but the French did, and they wanted to make sure that they had the right to resist oppression. It's John Locke on steroids, I think. The government exists to protect rights, sovereignty exists in the people and their representatives. All positions are open to talent and merit. Freedom of religion, sorry, clergy, and freedom of the press, due process under the law. The accused are innocent until proven guilty. Taxation based on the ability to pay. Once again, things that are France specific, but just dripping of the Enlightenment as well. Any questions or comments about any of those things? The accused are innocent until proven guilty. That's what we have too. You'll see, though, within a very short period of time, they flip that around. And actually, in France, for a long time, maybe even still today, you're basically, if you're arrested, you're basically kind of guilty until proven innocent. We'll have to check that with Madame Castor. I think she's been arrested multiple times in France. So we'll just, dang it, this is being taped, isn't it? Ah. So, these are words. And just because a parliamentary body puts together a document, it doesn't really mean very much yet. But this is the way that an artist interpreted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Um, I don't know if this says anything to you or if this speaks to you in any way, but we've got some stuff going on in this particular in this thing. What do you see, or what do you think is going on in um, this artist's rendition? Go ahead. Yeah, yep. It's a Liberty pole or a Liberty hat, and there was actually dancing around Liberty poles and Liberty hats at this point in time. And you can see that that's on the right-hand side of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the thing in the middle. And so this is going to be, France under the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The sun is shining. There's a little kid who's being, shown this by his mother, and everybody is dancing around a liberty pole and having a really good time. There's even flowers there. And or what? Yes, bad times, and that's on the other side of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So it's sort of like before the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Um, you know, man in a state of nature wanted to have a social contract, wanted to get a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Bad times, life in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. And quite frankly, France. Before the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, also bad times. Boo. And then once again, there we have France in 1789. It's going to be remade really quickly, and I'll tell you all about that on Thursday. Tomorrow you have the day off. Other than I think there's probably a short reading for you to do, but I won't lecture tomorrow. You're going to be meeting, hopefully, some of you will be meeting with some of your teachers, and maybe you want to meet with me. And if that's the case, then send me an email, and we could probably arrange something. I am done. What questions do you have for me?